Okay, so we are going to go over our lesson from February 8th, February 9th, which we talked about the beginning of World War I, but we started with our warm-up, February 8th, February 9th. You can pause the video if you need to take a second to open it up. So what we have here is an excerpt from Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, which is actually pushing forward a little bit because it comes towards the end of World War I. But this is to help us practice for our PBAs. Excuse me, guys. So what we're going to do is read through it and then answer some questions. It reads, "Gentlemen of the Congress, once more, as repeatedly before, the spokesmen of the Central Empires have indicated their desire to discuss the objects of war and the possible basis of a general peace." So it's a very long sentence. Now, I don't expect y'all to know, but the Central Empires are going to be those central powers: Germany, Austria, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So what this sentence is saying is the Central Powers want to discuss peace. Parleys have been in progress at Brest-Litovsk between representatives of the Central Powers, to which the attention of all the belligerents has been invited for the purpose of ascertaining whether it may be possible to extend these parleys into a general conference with regard to terms of peace and settlement. So the Central Powers are already meeting together, but now they want the Allies to come. The Russian representatives presented not only a perfectly definite statement of these principles upon which they would be willing to conclude, but also an equally definite program of the concrete application of those principles. So the Russians have a plan, and it sounds like they're pretty stuck on how they want this plan to go and how it's going to be implemented. Now, we're going to go to our actual questions. So we read the passage, and now we need to define these words. If you don't remember how to do it through Google Classroom, highlight the word, go to Tools, Dictionary, and it pops up right here. So we can see that parley means a conference between opposing sides in a dispute. And we could just stick with that short definition and write that in. So just copying a conference is like a meeting between opposing sides. That means like the two sides in an argument. In this case, the Central Powers and the Allies in a dispute. And the dispute in this case is a war. So we have belligerents, and we can do the same for that. Tools, dictionary. A nation or person engaged in a war or conflict. So we can put just that, a nation or person engaged in war or conflict. Then we have ascertaining. Find something out for certain. Make sure of, so we could just do find sorry guys, I downloaded so many Stardew mods yesterday and my computer is a little slow right now. So let's do find something out for certain. Now, in one or two complete sentences, summarize what the passage is saying. So now that we know these words, or oops, we forgot one, definite. To be sure of. We can go back and read the passage with a little more understanding. So once more, as repeatedly before, the spokesmen of the Central Empires have indicated their desire to discuss the objects of the war and the possible basis of a general peace. Parleys have been in progress at Brest-Litovsk between representatives of the Central Powers, to which the attention of all the belligerents has been invited for the purpose of ascertaining whether it may be possible to extend these parleys into a general conference with regards to terms of peace and settlement. The Russian representatives presented not only a definite statement of the principles upon which they would be willing to conclude peace, but also an equally definite program of the concrete application of those principles. So, in this first sentence, it says the Central Powers want to discuss peace. They've already joined together, let's just say Brest-Lit, with each other, but now they want everybody to come. But the Russians are pretty stuck on how they want things to go. And they're going to present these definite demands for peace. Now, I want you guys to summarize it in your own sentences. It's really important that I see that you can do it on your own. Now, type out the sentence that states what the Russians want to present. So, this is where I saw a lot of struggle with the PBAs. So we need to get used to, even with long sentences, typing out the full quotes that we can find in the articles and documents, just so we have a better understanding and a better quality of work. So you would type out, the Russian representatives presented not only a perfectly definite statement of the principles upon which they would be willing to conclude peace, but also an equally definite program of the concrete application of those principles. It's a lot, but we need to get used to writing these long sentences, and in this case, you just have to copy word for word. Okay, so we're going to pause, and then we're going to start our PowerPoint for today. So I want you to find, it says World War I PowerPoint at the bottom. I'm going to open it up. I'm just going to walk through. This is where you can listen. Okay, so here we are, the Great War. Now, towards the end of World War I, people didn't think it would be possible to have another world war, that this absolute destruction could not only be replicated, but multiplied. Well, there were a few, and we're going to talk about some of the main players that lived through World War I and were instigators and the main bad guys of World War II, particularly Adolf Hitler, Hertz Goering, Hans Himmler, and Rudolf Hess. They're going to be, we all know who Adolf Hitler is, but the other three were his after him, they were like the top Nazis. So looking back on the war, George Orwell wrote, "The quickest way to end a war is to lose it." And I just want you guys to think about that quote. Because does any country that goes to war, do they want to lose it to end the war quickly? No. So, and just as a disclaimer, we're going to be talking about sensitive topics and dehumanizing language. Like in our Reconstruction unit, there's a lot of talk of race and ethnic identity. We will encounter words and stereotypes of different races and peoples that can be offensive and make us uncomfortable. However, it's important that we acknowledge these things to understand history and how far we still need to go. Likewise, there are many images and topics we will discuss that may trigger negative emotions. It's important to let me know if you're feeling overwhelmed or need to discuss things. It's okay to need to step back. And I found this quote by Amanda Gorman from The Hill We Climb to be quite topical and sort of why we need to address these sensitive topics. And the quote is, "Because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." And And before we get any further, I do just want to talk about the absolute enormity of the death and destruction that happened as a result of World War One. I think it's important to acknowledge these things because we can, not just students, but anybody who reads about history, studies history, Hollywood, when they make war movies, they tend to glorify war. And the absolute destruction kind of gets lost in all of that. And while it can be a really fascinating time period to study, we still need to kind of step back and acknowledge the loss of life and how many lives were changed forever. I'm gonna move me up here real quick. For example, the grand totals were 9.7 million military deaths, 6.8 million civilian deaths, for a total of 16.5 million deaths, which was nearly 2% of the world's population died in World War One. But of course, those figures are vary depending on where. For example, the US isn't really going to have a lot of civilian deaths. Some had none at all. While Serbia had 275,000 military deaths, but nearly twice as many civilian deaths. They lost 16% of their population during World War One. The Ottoman Empire has even more grossly disturbing trends with 771,000 military deaths, but 2.1 million civilian deaths. And they lost 13% of their population. And civilians are going to be those people that aren't in the military, they're non-combatants, the elderly, women, children. So we're going to get into Europe before World War One. We've talked so far in this class from Reconstruction and industrialization to the Spanish-American War in the US, but we haven't really talked about what's going on in Europe. And at this time and prior to World War One, there's a lot of change and a lot of instability in Europe in general. So Europe before World War One. Now the map is going to look a lot different than the Europe we know of today, especially in Eastern Europe. It's missing a lot of those smaller countries, Poland, the Ukraine. These countries don't come into existence until after the war. And then we have the Ottoman Empire, which no longer exists, Persia, Spanish and French Morocco, and then Austria-Hungary. None of those exist. The people and the land is still there, but they're different countries, and the borders are different. So what's going on in Great Britain? In Great Britain was still an imperial power at the time of World War I, with colonies and territories across the globe. These colonies would become central to the battles in World War I and its outcome. Britain still commands the most powerful navy at the beginning of the war. And as far as like large battleships, I believe the European figures, like Britain had like some 50 odd battleships, whereas like Germany and France had less than 10. And if you look at the map, all of the red is controlled by Great Britain. Now, Canada, Australia are going to be territories, whereas the places you see in Africa and India and the Middle East are going to be colonies. The only thing that varies is the degree of independence they have. But still, when the war comes, Britain is able to call on the resources, the people, and all of that from almost half the globe. And then we have France. Like France, like Britain, France had a massive imperial empire. However, since 1792, there had been continuous changes and coups. That means a lot of it. The government was constantly changing. You went from democracy to monarchy to Napoleon, and it was just very unstable. Like it was constantly changing. At the onset of the war, France is in its third republic phase, which just means this is their third time at trying at democracy. But actually, it was just supposed to be a temporary government while they got their king back. So France had previously been at war with the German nation states in 1870. And if you look at this map, France controls most of West Africa, parts of Asia. This is Madagascar. So then we have Germany. And what we now know, what is known as Germany, did not come in existence until 1870. So Germany is a fairly new country. It's only about 40 to 50 years old. After the German nation states defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War, a bunch of individual princes, because there used to just be a bunch of tiny little territories ruled by individual princes, they elected one leader to become the leader of Germany. He would be known as the Kaiser. This also meant that they were late into the imperial game and only had a few colonies. But the Kaiser at the time of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II, wanted more colonies. And that's going to be Germany's primary motivating factor getting into World War I. Then we have the Russian Empire. Of course, we just know it as Russia. It's still sort of the same amount of land. The empire was led by Tsar Nicholas II. And though they had no colonies, they spread their empire from, this border all the way over to China, which led them into war with Japan, who also wanted China, and then into the Middle East, where Great Britain had a lot of stakes. So they also went into armed conflict against Great Britain over Afghanistan. Many were ethnic Slavs and shared a common religion with peoples under Austria-Hungary. So we're going to talk a lot about ethnicity, not so much race, but ethnicity, which is not only just how people look, but the religion they share, the language they speak. So those Russian Slavs and those ethnic Slavs under Austria-Hungary share a common religion and, in some cases, language and culture with Russia. So Russia felt very protective of those Slavics who were being mostly mistreated by Austria-Hungary. So we have the Austria-Hungary Empire, which, just a little background, in 1867, the two kingdoms of Austria and Hungary united under a common monarch. It was a multinational state at the time and had an extremely diverse and, in some cases, a reluctant population, including ethnic Slavs and Hungarians. Now, what multinational means is there's just a lot of different cultures, religions, and languages. Languages is going to be especially important because one of the major issues Austria-Hungary has in the war is communication, because all of them speak different language. So all these different colors show different language regions. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different languages being spoke within the Austria-Hungary Empire at minimum. So what's happening? You got the background of Europe, but what's happening right before war breaks out? We have this massive buildup of European militaries. So European powers are focused on building overseas empires. But to take over these colonies, they need a strong military. So they were building up their militaries, making more guns and ships, recruiting more men. And this kind of made everybody afraid of what their neighbors were doing. And this fear led to even more development and buildup of the militaries. And then it funneled into the idea, these secret alliances that were happening. With the expansion of European militaries and empires, alliances between countries started to develop in secret. And these are going to be our main alliances. We have the Triple Alliance, which is Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and on the fringe is the Ottoman Empire. And then we have the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Britain. And of course, imperialism. All these countries wanted overseas empires because Europe has been industrialized and built up for centuries in ways that other places across the globe haven't necessarily done. So they're running out of forest, they're running out of land that's suitable for agriculture and all these other different natural resources. But also, empires mean power, land means power, and they want power. So all these colored areas are going to be controlled by different European powers. Of course, America is in green, and they control Puerto Rico, a part of Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines. But the rest is European. The US doesn't have any real stakes in Africa, which has been carved to pieces. So we start to see this shift. Since the American Revolution, there's almost no European presence in the Western Hemisphere. They've moved on to Africa and Asia. And then we have nationalism. So nationalism is an intense pride and a willingness to fight or die for your country and believing that's superior, not just being proud to be American or whatever. You're like, no, we're the best, and we're going to prove we're the best, and we're going to take over the world. So prior wars for territory had led to ill feelings. So this was especially true between Germany and France, that had been in that Franco-Prussian War that France lost badly. So France is still salty about it, and Germany also, as a direct result of this, thinks France is a pretty weak nation and will be easy to conquer during World War I. And then ethnic nationalism is what caused a lot of tensions on the borders with Serbia and Hungary. Serbia is going to be another one of those Slavic states and they're independent of Austria-Hungary, and they want to make sure. They're getting pretty afraid that Austria-Hungary is going to come and get them. So we'll talk next class about the different groups that sort of bubble over and really spark World War I. But that's where we're going to end today. Now, the last thing we have to do, or last three things technically, are these questions 1, 2, and 3. Question 1. What were the 4 main causes of World War I? Remember main, M-A-I-N. Use slides 13, 14, 15, and 16. Using slides 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 of the slideshow, pick one major country before World War I and explain their situation. Did they have an empire? Were they a military power? And your answer should read something like, country A was ruled by a king. They had many overseas colonies and were an imperial power. They had a strong navy. Question 3. What do you think was the most important factor that caused World War I? Answer. Should be in 2 sentences minimum. So it should read something like, I think blank was the most important factor. I think it was the most important factor because blank. And that's our lesson for February 8th, February 9th.